My guest is Nir Cohen. He's a teaching and associated with the Rupin Academic Center in Israel. Welcome to the show, Nir.
Thank you very much.
Nir, you do work on migration, and you do work particularly on Palestinian Israeli migration. What characteristics generally can you say about the Palestinian migration? Are they stuck in their villages? Can they move into Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem? Do they move into Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem?
Well, Howard, this is really an interesting question, and this is one of the things we started looking at in this first paper that I presented here. And we can say generally that the profile of the internal Palestinian migrant in Israel is very similar to the profile of the demographic profile of migrants that are part of ethnic and national minorities in other countries around the world. So, for example, we've tried to see what's going on in places like the United States with the African American community, the Asian community, for example, in the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. And what we've seen is that basically there are some very interesting similarities, both in terms of the age, for example, the average age of the internal migrant, Palestinian or otherwise.
I assume they're younger.
They are much younger. As a matter of fact, the age cohort that is represented most pronouncedly among the migrating Palestinians is the 20 to 29. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about it for example, from a life cycle perspective. Younger people tend to move more often, especially after high school, if they enroll in universities. When they graduate from universities at 21, 22, 23, they obviously want to move again in most cases and perhaps get a job. And so that's an additional move. And
let's keep to the university for a bit. Which universities are they going to largely?
Well,
are they going to University of Haifa, Hebrew University, or are they sometimes going to the West Bank, Al-Quds University? What's the pattern there?
The research didn't actually look at those things, but I could probably tell you with a fair amount of confidence that Ben Gurion University and the University of Haifa are the two places where you have I think the largest percentage of Palestinians in the total student body. Now, this is not surprising, and this connects to our research. The majority of Palestinian Arabs in Israel live in the periphery. So basically the Haifa and the Galilee regions, or the northern regions or districts, as well as the southern district, essentially Be'er Sheva and south of Be'er Sheva. This is where we find a lot of the Bedouin. Most of the Bedouins are in the south. And so they remain, even while they're migrating, the vast majority of cases, they remain within these peripheral areas for, I think, a variety of reasons. One of which is, being perhaps remaining closer to the families. Another reason might be that it's just perhaps more difficult to move to some of the difficult from a sort of both an economic and psychological perspective, to move to some of the larger, the predominantly Jewish areas like Tel Aviv or the center in general. Economically speaking, those areas are much more expensive. Standard of living is usually higher. It's much more expensive to live there. Housing costs and so on and so forth. And since Palestinians on the average, their income is lower, on the average of course, is lower than the Jewish majority, then this could be one possible explanation. Another possible explanation is that remaining within close proximity of one's family and one's social network is, in a way, makes the move a little easier. Social networks are, around the corner, whereas in places, for example, like Tel Aviv or Rishon LeZion or other sort of predominantly Jewish cities, you wouldn't have, or the average Palestinian wouldn't have that sort of support.
Well, they haven't learned the whole objective in North America is to use the university to get away from your
parents. That's right. I think most people in Israel haven't learned that.
Yes.
I know for myself, for example, that was one of the reasons I grew up in the center of the country, and I wanted to go to the University of Haifa to get this 100-kilometer buffer zone between myself and my folks.
So you've become Americanized
That's
already.
right. And of course, after that, moving to the U.S., I've even extended that sort of buffer zone.
What about, like, in American campuses, Canadian campus, now you've got a majority of females on campus, and since the social structure of the Palestinian community is different, but it's Israeli now as much as it is Palestinians, and changing rapidly, particularly with regard to gender. How do you find the movement of women in this?
I think that's actually an excellent question, because one of the more perhaps surprising findings is that, contrary to what's happening in amongst other minorities, within the Palestinian minority, when it comes to migration, it's actually women that are that comprise the majority amongst the migrants. It's a little over 55%. And so this is very surprising. And I think the way, or a couple ways to explain it, is first of all to refer to the fact that women are now, Palestinian women are now the majority amongst bachelor and master degree recipients within the Palestinian community. So that, again, this correlation between education and mobility, I think, is something that the literature talks about quite a bit. So that's one thing to explain it, getting a master's degree and perhaps later on moving to get a job in an area that's not your place of origin, your area of origin. I think the other mechanism that's possibly at play here is the fact that there's this what is known as patrilocalism, which is a sort of still a tradition that's very much prevalent in mostly in the Muslim community in Israel, where males rather, after they get married, they're required, or it is expected of them. Really, it is expected of them to remain in proximity to their immediate and extended family within their villages and so on and so forth. So it's mostly the women in the post-marriage phase that are moving to the communities of the husbands, or if they're newly husbands. And so this, we think, this is what sort of propels a much higher propensity to migrate among Palestinian women compared to men.
Is there a big influence on the migration patterns of the fact that it might be harder for them to get into the, because their education entitles them to all kinds of positions and industry, etc., but it's so Jewish dominated that they feel uncomfortable, or there may be even informal restrictions against entry? Have you looked into that aspect of it, so it keeps them in the smaller areas instead of in the big cities?
That's another hypothesis that we want to look at in our next paper. But one of our assumptions is that this is exactly the mechanism here. We talked before a little bit about the idea of social networks and not wanting to be too far off from where they are. But I think another thing to kind of take into consideration is the fact that Israeli Jews are not always, to put it delicately, enthusiastic about having Palestinian neighbors. And so very often we hear about cases where Palestinians are rejected, even when they, for instance, pick up the phone and call some property or some piece of real estate that they've seen an ad about in the newspaper, and they just, people tell them it's not relevant anymore, or it's been sold, or it's been rented, and so on and so forth. So some of these things do happen, and I don't think we can ignore them.
So there's the non-discrimination principle isn't being applied adequately in Israel when it comes to Palestinians and free access to housing.
Again, this is not something that we checked, but we, just by reading the newspapers and hearing stories and so on and so forth, we know that it happens. It's hard to estimate how prevalent this phenomenon is. The other thing that we kind of have to take into consideration is the fact that, for example, many communities, especially the new communities in Israel, are, or sometimes they're called yeshuvim kehilatiyim, communal settlements, especially in the northern part of the country. They have what is called admission committees. And admission committees, essentially their role is to sort of select those individuals or families or households that would fit better with what they call the social atmosphere.
Right.
in that community.
So it's built-in discrimination.
Exactly.
Just
And
like you
so-
have co-ops in New York.
Exactly. So, they would probably, Palestinians as well as perhaps others, like perhaps gay couples would have a much more difficult time passing the admission committees.
With that, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you for
appreciate
having me.
Coming.